City Landmarks 50 Alliance. We welcome you to our panel discussion focusing on 50 years of landmarks law in New York City. As you know, the law was signed by Mayor Robert Wagner on April 19, 1965, making possible the preservation of our shared architectural heritage, the link between the past and the present day. The enthusiastic response to this event is vivid testimony to the growing influence of the remarkable public-private partnership of preservation that has engaged the passions and the imagination of New Yorkers and become the model for the rest of our nation. Your presence here is also a tribute to the outstanding record of the distinguished jurist, Chief Justice of the Appellate Court, Robert Katzman, whose guests we are all here today. And to our knowledgeable panelists and moderators, thank you all. And a special welcome to the judges of the federal courts, the district courts, and the International Court of Trade that have joined us. United States Field Goal. I'm the chair of the New York City Landmarks 50 Alliance, comprised of 177, and still growing, diverse and admired member organizations from all neighborhoods of our 5 boroughs, with membership ranging from the Apollo Theater in Harlem to the Asia Society on Park Avenue, the Bound House in Queens to the Bronx Museum of the Arts, Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, to Prisa, the Alice Austin House in Staten Island, and Casita Maria. These are just a few of the Alliance members who represent tens of thousands of New Yorkers and reflect the growth of preservation from a relics-oriented pursuit of the privileged few to an inclusive grassroots demonstration of civic involvement. Our thanks to the General Services Administration and Charlotte Cohn. As many of you know, this Thurgood Marshall Courthouse was constructed from 1932 to 1936. It was the last building designed by the noted American architect Cass Gilbert, who died in 1934, and the building was completed by his son, Cass Jr., in 1936. It was also the first purpose-built courthouse in the United States, as well as the first federal skyscraper. The courthouse was recently completely renovated, and all of the systems were upgraded, but all of the significant historic features were preserved. Thanks also to Karen Milton, the circuit executive who dealt with our abundance of riches today, this overflow gathering. And welcome, I neglected, and I'm sorry, to mention all those who are seated in the overflow room. You will have an opportunity to present your questions too, I hope. When asked the other day what I thought would be a good outcome of the 50th anniversary commemoration, my response, not surprisingly, was spontaneous and direct. It reflected a conspicuous need by those devoted to New York City land use to begin to put aside conflict and wisely embrace collaboration. All over our lonely planet, meaningful peace initiatives are taking place. So why not right here in New York City? Even the most ardent hardliners are conversing with their opposite numbers. It is long past noon that preservationists, activists, planners, developers, government and community leaders, and the real estate community engage in acts of urban civility and begin to constructively reason together. You may find that our commonalities are greater than our differences. differences. We do have basic shared concerns and interests. It is time for a higher level of discourse, or at least some level of discourse. Let's make friends with our opposite numbers. Let's initiate conversations and discussions and exchange views. It is time for dialogue, a citywide strategy to put confrontation aside and explore collaboration to resolve some of our thorniest problems. And now it is my honor to introduce Chief Justice Robert Katzman, who was appointed the Chief Judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit on September 1st, 2013. The Chief Justice, a summa cum laude graduate of Columbia College, is the recipient of MA and PhD degrees in government from Harvard University and a JD from the Yale Law School, where he was articles and book review editor of the Yale Law Journal. Among his many responsibilities, he chairs the U.S. Judicial Conference Committee on the Judicial Branch. His awards include the Stanley Fuld Award of the New York State Bar Association, the Maggio Pro Bono Award of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the Public Interest Scholarship Organization Lifetime Achievement Award. A distinguished lecturer and writer, his books include Regulatory Bureaucracy, the Federal Trade Commission and Antitrust Policy, and Courts and Congress. His most recent book, Judging Statutes, I don't mean to embarrass you, but you know in our house we know a place to advertise. His most recent book, Judging Statutes, has been described as a spirited and compelling defense of why judges must look at the legislative records behind the law. And even from this layperson's point of view, a very compelling case is made. A humanist and a scholar, he is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Judge Katzman.
Thank you very much, Barbara Lee. That was a wonderful introduction, and thank you for this. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse, one of the iconic landmarks of New York City, as Barbara Lee noted. My colleagues and I are pleased to join with GSA Regional Administrator Denise Pease, Charlotte Cohn, and the Landmarks 50 Alliance to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the New York City Landmarks Law. We open tonight, as we've done in the past, this courthouse to all of you who are here tonight and at other times throughout this anniversary year. I would not disagree that a more appropriate venue could not have been selected for tonight's program than this historic landmark building. The recent 6-year renovation, I'm repeating a bit of what Barbara Lee said because good news bears repeating, demonstrates the commitment of the federal government to preserving its historic structures while at the same time making them functional for the 21st century. This building is used every day by hundreds of people, judges, court personnel, attorneys, litigants, jurors, and the public. It is the place where justice is dispensed, and our physical venue is the embodiment of what we are about. The history of this courthouse parallels the ever-increasing strength of the landmarks preservation movement in the city and underscores the importance of the New York City Landmarks Law. Designed and constructed, as we know, by Cass Gilbert, who also designed and constructed the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. at the same time, 1932 to 35. This building was, importantly, the first federal courthouse to house both the federal courts and court-related agencies. The plot of land purchased by the federal government for this building dictated the resulting design, a 7-story base that outlines the contours of the site with a 31-story tower rising from its center. Overall, the courthouse is about 800,000 square feet. It is topped by a golden pyramid of gold gleaming terracotta tiles. And as was intended by its architect and the city fathers at the time, the courthouse at 40 Foley Square proudly anchors the civic center of Manhattan along Foley Square. The Court of Appeals and the Southern District of New York moved into this courthouse in early January 1936. The building opened to the bar and to the public on January 1st, 1936. Next year, the Court of Appeals will celebrate the 80th anniversary of the opening of this courthouse to the bar and to the public. In 2000, this courthouse was named for one of our country's truly great Americans, Thurgood Marshall, who sat in this courthouse as a judge in the early 60s on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Our courthouse shares many architectural features with the Supreme Court building in the United States: the gold leaf chrysanthemums on the elevator lobby ceilings, the marble walls, the brass images of plants and animals around the elevator doors, and serpentine staircases in the building's base. The spectacular main lobby entrance with its soaring 30-foot ceiling of gold leaf chrysanthemums recessed in squares of red and federal blue with the original brass and glass chandeliers and gleaming marble are just simply awe-inspiring. And every day when we come into this courthouse, we cannot be inspired by all this. I understand that many of you had a chance to, this evening, to see the 25th floor Circuit Library and the 17th floor Court of Appeals courtroom. These two spaces are among the most beautiful interiors in the courthouse, indeed anywhere. This courtroom, courtroom 506, where we are tonight, is the original en banc courtroom of the Southern District of New York. The courtroom is one of the 3 large ceremonial courtrooms constructed on the 1st, 3rd, and 5th floors, each with a different ornamental ceiling. A great mentor of mine, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the architect of the now classic Guiding Principles of Federal Architecture, and a co-chair of the advisory committee of our courthouse renovation project, once wrote, and I quote, "Public architecture is the bone and muscle of democracy. What buildings should aspire to," he continued, "is to bring people together in an experience of confidence and trust. Nowhere is this insight more telling than in the architecture of our courthouse." In Senator Moynihan's view, federal buildings, especially federal courthouses, must provide visual testimony, he wrote, to the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of the American government. And I'm sure all of you here tonight will agree that this courthouse embodies these architectural principles, a place where individuals can come together, regardless of station, to have their disputes peaceably resolved, where immigrants come to be naturalized and take on responsibilities of citizenship, where malefactors are prosecuted, all in a physical setting that inspires confidence that the rule of law will prevail. It can also be a place of communal learning and understanding, where the public comes to learn about our courts and our legal systems. Indeed, we are also a place on architectural tours, such as the Cass-Gilbert Trails. You might check that out. Now, our courthouse did not always look so good. Over the decades, this magnificent building slowly sank into decay. Despite the efforts of the General Services Administration, the federal government's landlord, the repair and maintenance needs of this courthouse outstripped the available funding and efforts to obtain larger funding allocations. Those were all unsuccessful. By the beginning of this century, it was clear to the judges of our court that the building's infrastructure no longer could support the operations of our courts and required a complete replacement of the mechanical, plumbing, and electrical systems. As we, most especially my predecessors John Walker, and most especially Dennis Jacobs, who saw this project really to its completion after several years, and our circuit executive, Karen Milton, and circuit architect Scott Tiemann and their wonderful team, as we embarked on this extraordinary effort to save this historic courthouse and preserve it for future generations of lawyers and litigants and the public. No one from whom the court sought assistance, including Congress, suggested that we abandon this building or that it be torn down in favor of a new modern structure. To the contrary, everyone agreed that a new building infrastructure had to be installed while preserving as much of the historic fabric of the building as possible. It was the intent of the courts and the design team, led by John Bell and Larry Gutterman of Beyer, Blinder, Bell, that the courthouse, at the end of this project, would still look and feel like the 1930s neoclassical structure it is, except that it would have a new backbone, better suited to supporting court operations in the 21st century. After a 6-year renovation project and restoration of the historic interior architectural features, the courthouse, I would say, has never looked better. The GSA, in response to a request from Barbara Lee Diamonstein Spielvogel of Landmarks Alliance 50, chose this courthouse as the place for this celebration, and that is testament to, I think, our success. The rehabilitation of this courthouse underscores the strength of the Landmarks Law and the importance of landmarks preservation constituency in the city. The New York City Landmarks Law reinforced the foundations for our infrastructure project. There was no question in anyone's mind that not only did this building have to be saved for future generations, but we also had to preserve and renew the historical interior finishes of the courthouse. The walnut paneling, the marble walls, the corridors, the gold leaf chrysanthemums, the brass elevator doors, the historic chandeliers. When we rewired, we did it with the idea of historic preservation in mind. And so, if you see the chandeliers in the front portico, the main lobby, the historic courtrooms, and the circuit library, they've been all rewired to meet 21st century lighting, energy, and environmental standards, while at the same time preserving the look of the courthouse that once was. Learned hand would feel right at home walking through our Center Street door today. This courthouse and its recent rehabilitation, as I said, are a testament to the vibrancy of the Landmarks Law. Susan Henshaw-Jones, the visionary leader of the Museum of the City of New York, the host of an upcoming exhibition on the Landmarks Law that opens April 20th, Saving Place, 50 Years of the New York City Landmarks, put it this way. The Landmarks Law fostered pride in neighborhoods and resulted in neighborhood preservation in every borough. The law ensured huge swaths of the city remain a rich and vital complex of the new and old. By preserving and saving this courthouse, this great monument to architectural history and civic spirit of our nation, we highlight continuity from generation to generation. It is important that our historic landmarks, like the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse, continue to be places where our communities can be welcomed into a space that fosters civility, social unity, and respect for the rule of law. Without our Landmarks Law and its devoted supporters, we would not have been able to preserve our rich heritage of the past for generations to come. By preserving our past, we give meaning and purpose to our future. Senator Moynihan would have approved. Thank you for coming tonight and for your great courtesy. Now on to a great program.
Thank you, Justice Katzman for your historic remarks. They will be quoted widely for a long time to come. And now we will turn to our moderators, who, after I introduce them, will introduce the panelists. Simeon Mankoff, on my far left, is the Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council, the citywide advocate for New York's 134 historic districts. If any of you are not aware, just last week, Crown Heights North 3 was designated the most recent historic district. There are more than 32,300 buildings and sites within the historic districts. Under Simeon's leadership since 2000, the Historic District Council is one of New York's most active voices for historic preservation, with a special focus on grassroots, community-based efforts. And on my right, Anthony Wood, the founder and president of the New York Preservation Archive Project, which was formed to preserve, document, and celebrate the history of New York City preservation. We have an archive of our history right here in New York in a private rather than public enterprise. The history of the New York City's landmark law and its first 50 years is now being archived to inform, inspire, and instruct future generations. And now, Simeon, Tony, and the panelists.
NIMBYs, nosy parkers, obstructionists. These are just some of the things preservation activists have been called by some of the more polite news media. I'm sure you all can imagine what we've been called in private. Despite the occasional derision, preservationists have been with New York City since the beginning, fighting on the front lines for a future which hasn't passed, in the eternal churning to wring every last cent out of our city's real estate, consequences be damned. Since 1965, our most potent tool has been the Landmarks Law, and, to an arguable extent, New York's ongoing success has shown this tool to be a good one. But is it enough? Tonight, we hope to reflect on where we are, how we got there, and where we hope to be in our ongoing campaign to honor the past as we imagine our future. Joining us in conversation are 6 remarkable and knowledgeable guests. Starting from my far right, Kent Barwick is former chair of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and president emeritus of the Municipal Art Society, where he served in leadership positions for 4 decades. He's a founder of the Historic Districts Council, the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance, the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and the Preservation League of New York State, and continues to serve on many preservation and environmental boards throughout New York State. Andrew Berman, a lifelong New Yorker, has been the executive director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation since 2002. Before joining the Society, he worked in senior policy positions for Tom Duane, representing Greenwich Village, Chelsea, and other parts of Lower Manhattan in the City Council and the New York State Senate. Peg Green has been the president of the New York Landmarks Conservancy for over 2 decades. She serves on the boards of Preservation Action, Save Ellis Island, the Governor's Island Alliance, the advisory board of the Lower East Side Tenant Museum, and has spoken internationally on preservation for the United States State Department. Paul Goldberger, Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic, is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, author, lecturer, educator, consultant, and advisor on architecture and planning matters. Paul has served as architecture critic for the New York Times and the New Yorker. Philip Lopate is an award-winning essayist, film and architectural critic, writer, poet, and teacher. Born in Brooklyn, he has taught creative writing and literature in public schools, Fordham, Cooper Union, University University of Houston, Hofstra University, New York University, Bennington College, and Columbia University, where he serves as the Director of Nonfiction Writing. Gene Norman is an architect and was chair of the LBC, immediately succeeding Mr. Barwick. Prior to joining the commission, he worked with New York State's Urban Development Corporation, where he helped develop thousands of housing units upstate and supervised residential and commercial development in Harlem. Each of these guests will be presenting a short opening statement, followed by one question from Tony and I. Following that, there will be an opportunity for you in the audience to have your questions answered. Given the size of the audience and the panel, please write your question on the cards provided and give to the volunteers who will be circulating throughout collecting. Then be passed to us, and we will hopefully get some questions asked. Thank you all for joining us, and now, Gene.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the audience for being here tonight. I don't know who picked me to be the lead-off hitter. Here I am. I almost feel like Derek Jeter. Of course, he's retired, but I'm retired too. So. 32 years ago, I'm going to say that again. 32 years ago, I was appointed as the chairman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. I happened to be the first full-time chairman because prior to my installation, the chairmanship was a different animal. I was there all the time, worrying. I used to have hair. But I think Ed Koch, who used to have hair, thought that I would be a good compliment, and he brought me in as a full-time chairman. In those days, the city was undergoing, and I think it's still undergoing, a tremendous building boom where people were trying to develop the cracks in the sidewalks. They were trying to transfer development rights from ponds, from clouds, from wherever, to build and build and build. So the commission had a very busy time. Today the commission still has a very busy time. And I've noted that some of the problems that I tried to solve, and in fact did solve a few, are still with us. The one that I reflect on most is the fact that it is still considered a silk stocking kind of activity. And we have to find more ways to get more people involved. We have to find more ways to get the diversity of this city attuned to preservation activities, because there really is strength in numbers. And the more people who understand how important it is to have landmarks and support landmarks, the better off we all will be. The second thing is that there needs to be more money allocated to the Landmarks Commission. It does a job that increases every time it takes an action. We just heard from Barbara Lee that a new historic district had been created. Well, is there enough money in the budget to support the commission's work, which is now increased? I think not. I just saw a signboard that said stop. Since I'm a careful driver, I would stop.
Thank you.
I want to thank Barbara Lee for putting this panel together and for inspiring a host of celebrations going on around town, celebrating the 50th anniversary of our landmarks law. Thank goodness she did, because we have a lot to celebrate. Residents of every borough enjoy the individual landmarks and the historic districts that have been created. Tourists flock to New York to go to our landmark cultural institutions and theaters. And our landmarks law still is the model for laws An administration zoning proposal to allow taller buildings in neighborhoods across the city threatens residents who have fought hard to achieve protections from contextual districts and historic districts. There has to be a way to increase affordable housing without damaging the character of livable, human-scale neighborhoods, which provide housing for many income levels. Density is the planning mantra of the day. This isn't Wyoming. We are a dense city. We have grown enormously in recent years, and there are developments across our waterfronts that house more people than many states. And the Landmarks Commission has approved many fine new buildings in historic districts. We have a lot of work to do. We still haven't created enough economic studies to back up what we know about how preservation creates local jobs and revitalizes communities. We haven't shown elected officials at all levels of government that there's a broad constituency for preservation and one that votes. Preservation is a bipartisan issue, and we have friends in both parties. Preservation laws in New York City and in America always come from the people. They're not instigated by the government. We're here today because of the work of people like Jane Jacobs and Jacqueline Kennedy and Brendan Gill and Ada Louise Huxtable and James Marston Fitch and many, many others. It's our responsibility now to protect and build on that legacy so that other people can come after us and celebrate the lost centennial. Thank you.
There are two ways of looking at New York's relationship to the past. The first is that the city is amnesiac, since it keeps plowing under its built environment and constructing over it. Or as the poet James Merrill put it, as usual in New York, everything is torn down before you have had time to care for it. Let me try to recall what building stood there. Was there a building at all? End quote. The second response is that New York is intensely aware of its history and forgets nothing. Every year, dozens of studies about some corner of New York, like the Grand Army Concourse or the Gowanus Canal, are published. My friend Mike Wallace, who is busy at work on Volume 2 of Gotham, tells me it is harder and harder to keep up with the reams of historical research that keep accumulating. I doubt that this was always the case. Much of our historical subconsciousness has burgeoned in the last 50 years since the passage of the Landmark Preservation Law. And of course the law never could have passed if there hadn't already developed a consensus among thinking New Yorkers that its historical shards were worth preserving. As I see it, this self-awareness dates back to around 1930. Prior to that, New York was often regarded, especially by Europeans, as an ugly, chaotic, intimidating city. The familiar line was, it will be a swell place if they ever finish it. The jumble of building types, sometimes 10 to a block, seemed rather dissonant to those who had grown up in older cities. Then, due to the Great Depression, there was a halt in construction after the Empire State Building, and it continued through World War II because of a shortage of building materials. When the war ended in 1945 and New York was universally regarded as the capital of the world, suddenly that higgledy-piggledy, polyphonic, mercantile-driven, simultaneous honking street style began to look beautiful, or at least jolly laid, as the French said. You had the glories of the Art Deco city, the Chrysler and the Empire State and the Chain buildings, and you had that harmonious setback, mountain peak, skyscraper cityscape seen from New York Harbor that Paul Goldberger has celebrated as so ravishing. Raymond Kohlhaas dubbed it Manhattanism, this Mayan Babylonian crown subset of modernism. In any case, the New York aesthetic had had 20 years to gel in that construction lull and had come to seem, well, classical, lovable, or at the very least its own thing. Yet the city, prospering in the 50s and 60s as the capital of corporate America, kept knocking down old buildings and putting larger edifices in their place until it destroyed our own cave of Caracalla, Penn Station, and the good citizens said enough, and the Landmark Preservation Law was passed. The next surge in historical subconsciousness occurred in the go-go 1980s when a real estate boom drove up the residential prices steeply and brutally. Suddenly everything old became the selling point. Pre-war apartments, skylights, moldings, fireplaces, what had seemed tired and shabby got recast as highly desirable, especially as there was a turning away from the harsher purities of modernist glass wall architecture. And so a nostalgic embrace of adornment and older materials occurred. Why sell for Pomo cartoon of bespoke timidity, a cowardice, and above all, a self-satisfaction, this insistence that each new building be a good neighbor and respect its context. He wondered why we couldn't have a Frank Gehry, a Zaha Hadid, a Jean Nouvel, and Christian Fontaine-Park of our own. Lo and behold, though we didn't live long enough to see it, unfortunately, we do have a Gehry or several, a Nouvel, a Fontaine-Park, etc. It doesn't seem to have made much difference in the overall look of the city.
Thank you. Thinking about 50 years of the landmarks law, inevitably I look at it through the lens of the experience of Greenwich Village, which many would consider in some ways the quintessential New York landmarks neighborhood. And I think it really reflects all of the successes and all of the challenges that we face with historic preservation right now in our city. The Village is an extraordinarily beautiful and historic neighborhood, exceptionally well preserved, and that is a key component of its incredible economic vitality, its draw as a tourist destination, its role as a wellspring of culture in our city, the fact that it has, to this day, an incredibly strong, cohesive, well-organized community, and the fact that it has become an increasingly sought-after and desirable neighborhood, more so every day. I think we can also look at the Village in terms of the successes of historic preservation in that in recent years we've seen the scope of where preservation has gone expanded to places that in the first wave in the 1960s and 1970s we didn't consider as much. More so looking at cultural landmarks and working class history. And in the last decade we've seen the Greenwich Village Historic District expanded into the old working class South Village. We've seen a new East Village Historic District and places like the Meatpacking District designated, which are really positive developments in the evolution of historic preservation in our city. But we also see some of the great challenges that landmarks preservation faces. We can preserve buildings, but it's much harder to preserve the people, the businesses, and the institutions that are attached to them. Now, generally speaking, landmark designation, I think, can have an overall beneficial effect on all of those fronts, but it's certainly by no means a solution to the problem of the loss of affordability, of neighborhood businesses, and of long-standing institutions in our communities. We also face the challenge, frankly, of what we're seeing in terms of the evolution of the way in which landmark designation and preservation is being regulated in our city. And I would posit that we've seen a drift in recent years from the Landmarks Preservation Commission, that we have seen more new projects approved in historic districts that we probably would never have imagined being allowed in historic districts, and more buildings within historic districts. Demolition and very serious alteration that I think we never would have conceived of as being a part of our regulatory framework. But I have to agree with Peg and say that I believe that the biggest challenge we face right now is this concerted effort that we're seeing from the real estate community, which until very recently tried to portray landmark designation as an impediment to economic development, and then suddenly shifted gears and says that now landmarks designation is an impediment to affordability. It's incredible that they have the temerity to suggest both, but they are in some ways winning that battle, and it's really incumbent upon us to persuade New Yorkers that in fact landmarks preservation can be an important and helpful tool in all of those efforts. Thank you.
Notwithstanding the fact that everything I had intended to say has been said more comparatively, I will proceed. I was thinking about how you get from a rude town in the end of the 18th century to the city where everybody in today's world wants to be. And it's not by accident. We've always been aspirational people, but there are significant steps, and everybody has their own list somebody had this idea of building the Erie Canal, an idea that every member of the New York City delegation to the state legislature voted against. They took this sort of upstate boondoggle. The Croton Aqueduct, Central Park, the consolidation of the 5 boroughs, the establishment in New York of the first zoning, the first time somebody has said in America, or in most of the Western world, that there had to be some principle by which you could limit development. And then the New York City Landmarks Law, the law that the real estate board worried would end the progress of New York. Well, here it is 50 years later, and there's not a scintilla of evidence that our appetite for invention, for novelty, has diminished one bit. We are as successful, and as the figures have shown, as we have been at preserving things that need to be preserved. We have also continued to have a real zeal and hunger and appetite for the future. It's been remarkable, in fact, in the last several decades, how we have used the structures that we've saved in novel ways. And not only have we reused buildings, of course, industrial buildings have become high-tech places, but we've started, I think, to learn as a society from the lessons of the past. I can't help but think here in this age when we built all these fabulous new parks, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Battery Park, that somehow the rediscovery of Olmsted's principles and Vaux's principles in the designations and celebrations of Prospect Park and Central Park had something to do with that. I wanted to say that we're lucky in our generation. We're standing, as they say, on the shoulders of people who gave us something. Many have been mentioned, some that worked for Albert Bard and Harmer Goldstone and Otis Brett Pearsall, who happily is alive and well monitoring this event, Whitney Seymour, Ada Louise Huxtable, but also the people that fought for this law, like Jeff Freelander, Lenny Cohen, Jack Kerr, and the late Dorothy Miner, who we, all of us, most of us on this panel, and many of you in the audience, have been the beneficiaries. I guess the question is, what now will we pass? It's a little, I think we should be holding the hubris. We don't want this to be remembered like poor George Bush's event on the aircraft carrier, a mission accomplished. So there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
I must say that I find the notion that the Landmarks Law is 50 years old now both exciting and sobering. It's exciting for the reasons we've been talking about. It underscores how established preservation has become in this city for all the ongoing challenges. It is more established than I think the creators of the law ever imagined it would be. It's particularly sobering for me because I remember writing a story for the New York Times in 1975, marking the 10th anniversary of the law. So it reminds me that I've been watching it for a long time. But mainly I think of this as a moment when preservation has become so entrenched as a part of our culture that we really can celebrate rather than just fight for attention. When the preservation movement has become a given in the world of real estate and in our political culture. But then, of course, I think of the Frick and the New York State Pavilion and the fight across the river about the LG building on the Palisades, not to mention the historic district issues we've been talking about. And then I realize it is Panglossy, and not to say naive in the extreme, to think of preservation as a war that has been won. Many battles have been won, but the war, I think, will never be won. It will go on forever. But maybe, just maybe, that is how it should be. If the preservation movement becomes too much a part of the establishment, we risk losing the critical edge that has always been so important. And we risk losing the ability to think in new terms, to recognize and deal with the challenges of modernist preservation, for example, as well as to think creatively about the relationship between the preservation movement and the environmental movement, which will be increasingly important in the next phases of preservation's history. The preservation of landscape goes hand in hand with the preservation of architecture, just as the preservation of streets goes hand in hand with the preservation of architecture. When you think about the growing recognition of these things, it begins to become clear how far the movement has come in the last half-century since the legislation was passed. It is not just all about famous monumental buildings, and it is not just all about fancy neighborhoods. And sometimes it is not just about buildings at all. But the most important reason that it's okay that the war will go on forever is because there are no formulas. There are no ways in which we can predict what the key preservation issues of the future will be. And because we always want the preservation movement to exist in a state of dynamic tension with the real estate industry. They've often been allies, and that is reassuring and encouraging. But they will never be joined completely, nor should they be. The city needs to grow and change, and it needs to preserve. Finding that balance, I think, is a challenge that every generation, including the ones coming, will need to figure out for itself.
Thank you to all of our panelists for keeping with our draconian time here. Before I begin my questions, and then Tony will speak, and Tony and I begin our questions, I do again remind everybody, if you want to join the conversation, please fill out your questions. There should be people circulating around to pick up these things. I'm doing myself glad to be here. So, my first question will be to Jean. Jean, you brought up a really good point about the diversity and how do we open this up, how do we open this exciting movement up to the widest degree possible, especially considering our new mayor, who is running on a very progressive, open government idea and trying to bring more people into the decision-making of New York. What role does the mayor play in the workings of the Landmarks Commission, and what's the current role of City Hall? What do you think it should be, and how can the mayor perhaps open up preservation to the widest audience possible?
Good question. I know that the Landmarks Commission is not represented here tonight. Huh? Forgive me, I spoke out of turn perhaps. But it's the kind of thing that you should be at. It's the kind of things that you should have placards holding up to let people know what you do, who you are, and why you exist. And not enough of that is happening. That's how the diversity can be expanded. As far as the mayor goes, I mentioned that the commission relies on a budget. So I would hope that the mayor is supportive of the work of the commission and makes sure that the commission moves ahead with adequate funding, a selection of good commissioners, because it's not just the chair that does things, and also a staff who can perform the needed tasks that are to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. Okay, you've already called out the clear and present danger facing landmarks at this moment in time and suggested some responses to that. I want to take us to a particular threat around a type of building that I know the Conservancy has been very involved with, which is our religious buildings in New York. And now with the Catholic Church downsizing and others, we seem to be faced with that problem again. Should New York be more aggressively using the landmarks law to try and deal with that? Or are there new tools that we need to be creating in a city to protect that piece of our heritage?
First of all, we all need to repent.
It's the season for that, so.
You know, I wish I could say that landmarking would save all these structures. I don't think it does. There are wonderful landmark religious institutions, and there are many more worthy to be landmarked. But if there is no use, if there's no congregation, if there's no alternate use, it's not going to matter. And this is a national problem, and it's needs to be a real look at alternatives. If they can't be used as religious institutions, what are appropriate uses for them? And I know that we don't often like to think of the houses of worship being turned into condos or turned into schools or other institutions, but that's the way, that's coming. And it's our job to make sure that they're being adapted appropriately. And I think that's the best we can do, because we're going to be facing a huge amount of these buildings needing some help.
Thank you. Mr. Lippett, both you and your brother have long-time public fascination and engagement with the city. What do you recommend instilled such love of New York, and for the sake of our collective future, how do we inspire more people to feel that way?
Well, it's true, I love New York, and I love New York partly because I have a perverse obstinate nature. I remember when there was a lot of talk about the death of New York, largely in the 80s, and I never could subscribe to the apocalyptic scenario. I always had a more dialectic sense that one part was maybe dying, and another part was raising up. So I don't feel nostalgic. I grew up used to the city changing a lot, and I like the aesthetic, the gestalt of New York City. There are some things I really do miss, and some of it has to do with when New York was more of a working class city with many more blue collar jobs, and I kind of wish that there was a way to landmark those jobs, not just the factories that they were in. I think that the secret to loving New York is not being too alarmist. There will be that favorite bakery will close down, and sometimes it's because the owners really want to retire to Florida, and it's not such a shame, So I mean, I think that awareness that everything changes, is a very New York thing, and ultimately I think that the root of loving New York is a kind of stoicism.
Very good. Andrew, question to you. In October, the Citizens Emergency Committee to Preserve Preservation issued a report that noted that only some 3.2% of all properties in New York City are actually regulated by the Landmarks Law. Yet the Real Estate Board of New York continues to maintain, as you suggested, that preservation is a key obstacle in the creation of affordable housing and must be reined in. Can you expand a little more on how we as preservationists, how you as someone who's been active in affordable housing, can take on that issue and get the truth out there?
Sure, I take this meme somewhat personally, as someone who grew up in affordable housing and lived most of my life in rent-regulated housing, and who has worked to help preserve the affordability of neighborhoods that I've lived in. This notion that preservation is somehow an impediment to, even an enemy of, our goals of affordability for the city really burns me up. And I think it's not supported by the evidence. Certainly if you look, even just a sort of common sense look at our neighborhoods. First of all, when our buildings are torn down, so let's say they weren't landmarks, it's unbelievably rare that they're torn down to be replaced by affordable housing. They're typically torn down to be replaced by market rate, usually luxury housing, which clearly does not contribute to the affordability of our city. If you look at a neighborhood like Greenwich Village, which some people have tried to use actually as an example of this issue, well, here's a neighborhood that's largely landmarked. Look how expensive it's gotten in recent years. As if, a beautiful neighborhood with incredible public transportation located midway between Midtown and the financial district would not have gotten expensive over the last several decades regardless. But if you look at the parts of our neighborhood that are not landmarked, such as the Greenwich Village waterfront, they you've probably seen the steepest and most exponential rises in rents, property values, etc. You've certainly seen that within the historic district, but you've also seen a greater level of maintenance of existing affordable housing where it is. The landmark designation will never be a solution to our city's problems of affordability, but I think it overall can have a beneficial effect where it does exist. It prevents demolition. The demolition can often result in the loss of affordable units. It can be an impediment to one of the tools that developers will sometimes use to push long-term tenants out, rooftop additions, interior construction, things of that nature that's often used to make life difficult for or harass long-term tenants. So, I would simply say that while landmark designation is not the answer to our affordability problem, it's certainly not the enemy, and if anything, I would say it probably has an overall beneficial effect, and certainly not a negative one.
Here we go. Ken, you were brought on to the LPC as a chair, as a known preservationist. Do you think this is an important qualification for the chair, and can you imagine that it really happening again?
Well, your credentials look better after a while when you start. We were testifying when I was working as a young advocate for the Landmarks Commission and the New Yorker reporter took note of what I'd said. It was one of the more ridiculous descriptions of the building that I hadn't seen in the Bronx. Where I said it was almost Tuscan. So I think that I don't think it's necessary to be an architectural historian. I think that's probably slightly more desirable than being a lawyer, but it seems to me that what you want are people who care about the city, who are good listeners. I mean, this is very much a dialogue between the public. The reason the founders, it seems to be established instead of a one czar, 11 people, because you really have to discover in an almost legislative process what is important. I still remember having hearings on Town Hall. We wanted, people were trying to save Town Hall. We didn't, people on the commission, the staff, and the commissioners didn't think it was likely to warrant designation, but we had a hearing. And at the hearing, we had 2 hearings actually over a couple of days. Musician after composer after impresario came forward and said, the acoustical qualities of this building are incomparable. Well, we were looking at it as a piece of architecture. We were looking at this room is about that. It's nice, but it's nothing special. But we learned in that, listening to the public process, that there was something indeed incomparable about Town Hall, and today, happily, it is preserved. And so I think it's that kind of openness to the process, not counting the votes, not with your finger in the wind, but listening carefully, good researchers to determine what's really important. It's an imperfect process, and things that probably should have been designated weren't back in the 60s. And there are probably things today that none of us appreciate that somebody will be bringing forward. And when Greenwich Village was designated, for instance, there were no Art Deco buildings, there were none of those industrial buildings over towards the river. They were all left out. The only person who cared was Elliot Walensky, who kept dragging all this over to see these buildings. Now, of course, they're seen as great treasures. So no, I don't think you have to be a preservationist. I think you have to be open. You have to see how significant the law is and how it's also a very simple law. When I took office in the middle of a fight over Radio City Music Hall, I think Barbara Lee was there, and my predecessor and a number of other people, including Alton Marshall, who claimed to be one of the authors of the Landmarks Law, said that the Landmarks Law was unconstitutional on its face as it applied to interiors. The Rockefellers were saying this, and I remember I was really scared, and there was a meeting the night before the hearing, and Ralph Mennepace, who some of you Lee Seymour and Cy Vance came, and they said, listen, it's a pretty simple law. It's just like a recipe. You bring a cup of water to boil, and then you add a teaspoon of salt and wait 20 minutes. And what they were saying was that the processes of this law was really simple, and it was fair, and if you followed those processes, you didn't have to have a PhD in art history, you didn't have to be a lawyer. All you had to do was exercise human judgment, and mostly it worked out. And I think that's true. It's an extraordinary law in that regard. I'm not expert as our host is and others in legislation, but it's simple, and it has stood the test of time in the courts, and most importantly in New York, it has stood the test of time on the sidewalk.
Thank you.
Paul, last year on a panel that was dealing with landmarks, the historian Ken Jackson surprisingly stated, "History is for losers." He shares the opinion held by the Real Estate Board of New York that preservation has gotten out of hand. At past landmark law anniversaries, you've talked about the need to balance change with continuity. Do you feel that balance has been lost today in New York? And if so, in whose favor has it shifted? And what should we do to restore that balance?
Thanks for giving me the easy one. I think the balance is at risk. I don't think it's been completely lost. I think the revenue arguments, as Peg and Andrew both made clear, are nonsense. What they remind me of more than anything are the arguments of Republicans about Obamacare and how it's destroyed the economy. Even though all the evidence is actually to the contrary, that it's been good for the economy and good for people's health. But they just keep on saying it over and over and over again. Similarly, I think the Real Estate Board is operating on the presumption that if they utter an untruth enough times, people will begin to be familiar and people will begin to accept it. And in fact, often they have, and that's challenging. That is a problem, just as defending the healthcare law is an enormous challenge and problem, particularly when it has to be defended against untruths. As to the larger issue of the balance, I worry about it in the future more than I do right now, because I think that the current initiative for affordable housing, which all of us support in principle, being tied so directly to zoning changes, has the potential to, in fact, throw it out of balance. And I think that potential planning change will have a far greater effect on destroying what sense of vague equilibrium exists now than anything that the preservation community or the Landmarks Commission has ever done or would consider doing. To me, that is the real challenge in terms of throwing things out of whack. It is easy to walk down 57th Street today and think that things are, that the balance has been lost, and it certainly has on that street. But in the city overall, I don't think so. As I said earlier, I am not a preservation fundamentalist, and I do believe firmly that a city that doesn't change and grow a certain amount will die. Growth and change is in our DNA, but the real challenge of landmarks is in recognizing today that laissez-faire will not give us the city we want. If we do nothing, we will end up with a city we do not want. And so we do need to be proactive and intervene and manage change. Growth and change, to say growth and change are good, may be all well and good, but just like any other kind of growth and change, just like your lawn, your garden, your hair if you have hair, anything that grows needs to be managed, and so too with the growth and evolution of the city. Preservation, I think, is one of the greatest tools we have ever created for managing growth, and I hope it continues to do so.
I'm going to open this up just to the panel in general. I've got some good questions here. This one is, the uncovering of mosaics at 3 Bryant Park raises an important question, not just about landmark preservation, but about art preservation, public art. This is something we also dealt with at 510 Fifth Avenue. What can be done to save artworks that exist within the public realm?
Moving right along.
I think we're for it.
I think part of it depends on persuading either the current owner or the future owner of the building. And the Landmarks Commission moved very quickly to landmark the Ben Shahn murals in the landmark Bronx Post Office last year. And they heard compelling reasons for doing so from artists and art historians all over the country. And the post office acceded to that. So I think part of it is a persuasion. You know, letting the people who own the building now understand how important it is, and letting any future owner know the same. And if possible, to get an easement or get it landmarked. But I think you've got to really, it's a selling job.
Since part of what we want to do tonight is look to the future, I've got a question here from the audience that does that. How do we quickly and judiciously integrate preservation and restoration with the critical need to deal with climate change, sea rise, and the other issues we're facing in terms of sustainability? Another easy question.
Well, I think to a certain degree there's a natural synchronicity between them, although, obviously they're not interchangeable, but, I think as Paul was saying before, a laissez-faire approach to the growth in our city is not going to lead to either the city we want or a healthy city. And I think sustainability is obviously one of the things that we need to think about. And I think that there are a lot of places in the city where working with what we have as opposed to just going for a bigger, more greater approach is wise for a variety of reasons, including the fact that there are some parts of the city where we probably don't want to get denser, where we don't want to have more there because of the risk from climate change. There obviously are many parts of the city where new development, denser development is appropriate, but especially with what we saw with Sandy a few years ago, there's a lot of parts of the city where we have to think about not increasing our footprint, but reducing it.
I would also add, I can tell you that sometimes the best way to save energy is to not build a new building. Because you there's a lot of embedded energy in old buildings. You keep it working for you by not spending more energy demolishing a building and constructing another.
I just want to note that
I think it has a lot to do with the waterfront also, and part of our whole integrated waterfront policy. Every time you take away marshlands, every time you build high-rise on the waterfront, you're increasing risk, and so I think that we really need a much more coordinated waterfront policy.
I think there's been some improvement, but it's unfortunate that the city's leading waterfront development agency, the Economic Development Corporation, is essentially a real estate agency. They're not trying to coordinate development. Their job is to move properties and make money. It seemed to me, Tony, that implicit in your question was a broader question, that how can we better integrate the growth of the city and the need to preserve things? How to integrate the market forces and our desire to have affordable housing? And it's astounding to me that in a city that is essentially known for having the smartest people on the planet that come here from all over, they've been educated here, they were born here in some of the best schools in the United States, that we still have no real process. City planning still consists of some guys around the corner figuring out based on whatever formula you want, your percentage of the land area of the population. Tell us what you plan to do. This is the only city in the world that has community boards that we have 62 community boards that are bigger than Richmond, Virginia. We don't give them any staff. There are no professional planners. There's no business in here, the smart, sophisticated city, to really take advantage of the people who know the neighborhoods best. You know that works. And you know that's how places like Greenwich Village and Brooklyn Heights were saved, because the people in the neighborhood are capable and they figured out how to do that. It's not reserved to just those two places. So it seems to me that a progressive mayor, instead of suddenly acting like AB, should try to develop a dialogue with communities.
Working within New York City, especially in real estate, it feels sometimes like everything is negotiable. Is there a moment where you just feel that the answer is no, that you do a dead stop? And if so, what do you think that moment would be? In terms of, there are a lot of questions here. How high is too high? What to do about the seaport? What about the Frick? I mean, are there things that you just think are a standard beyond which you shall not draw?
I think the seaport is certainly one of them. You know, this is the last place where you really see what early New York looked like. It is how we became a great city, by having the seaport, by having that area. And the city has never owned it as a real part of Manhattan or of the city. The next developer to come along and solve the problems for it. And of course, the current developer can't do anything unless they build a giant tower on a pier in the river. Speaking of sustainability. So I think the seaport is a great place to start, to just say, wait a second, this is nuts. And we want it to be integrated into the city. We want to have everybody appreciate the history, the beauty, the buildings that are there, and really preserve it and enhance it.
Does anyone want to comment if the Frick is such a situation?
Or another situation where you just say, just no, the answer is no.
Okay, another question. There is a view today that the Landmarks Preservation Commission is very constrained in its designation activity by the need to obtain at least tacit approval of City Hall and affected property owners. How different is that from what some today think was the golden age of designation in the late 70s and the 1980s? And maybe we'll put the two former chairs on the hot spot to share reflections.
Well, I was very lucky to work for a mayor who had, Koch, who had grown up in Greenwich Village. And so he considered, from back when he was a district leader and a councilman and a congressman, he understood that there's a picture of him somewhere holding up a placard with Rittenberg probably penciled for him. So he understood that preservation in his district was just as important as housing of seniors. And he treated the agency at that time as a quasi-judicial agency. Not once in the time that I was the chairman did anybody seriously high up in the administration ever try to tell me what to do. In part, that was because of the high-caliber deputy mayors then, Nat Leventhal and Bobby Wagner. And in part because I learned early in my trying to go over there and report to people that I didn't have a boss, and so why go over there unless you had to? But I don't think many other chairmen had quite that wonderful opportunity that we had. And I think it wasn't. I don't think it was as easy for Jane or for Lori or many others.
For me, it was somewhat simple. I read the landmarks law, and I didn't see in the landmarks law anything that said you have to have owner's consent before you
officials who might not represent any landmarks, that this agency should get the resources it deserves. Anybody, a lot of strategic minds up around the table, not the ones.
Well, you know, as somebody mentioned when they were speaking earlier, every time we designate a new building or a new district, the burden on the agency goes up, and we certainly have not seen commensurate increases in the agency's budget. You know, here's a place where we could make common cause with the folks in the real estate industry if there was a genuine interest in improving the system as opposed to dismantling it. We all want to see property owners be able to get as expeditious consideration as possible for their applications. We all want to see the agency function quickly, smoothly, efficiently. Clearly, one of the impediments to that is the lack of budget. So you would think that that should be something that, no matter what your perspective on the relative benefits of designation, that everybody in the city council and everybody in the city government can support. If I'm not mistaken, it's the agency with the smallest budget of all of the city's agencies, and even just at 3% of the city's property, that would probably be a medium-sized city or even a large city in many other parts of the country. So it clearly deserves a lot more resources than it has.
I think there's another element which is, I agree completely, but which is to make the regulation as elegant as possible. And I see Frank Sanchez down here in the front row behind Barbara Lee. And when Frank worked for the City Landmarks Commission, he did two things that I remember. One, when the Broadway theaters were all being designated, it was a huge fight, and the theater owners were sure that the world would end if the theaters were designated. You could never put out another show because for this show you wanted the house to look this way. And Frank very carefully went through guidelines for the Broadway theaters, and I was at this is also the 40th anniversary of all that theater fight, and I was at an event with all the theater people, and they think it worked perfectly. And nobody has any complaints in the theater community about how the theaters have been regulated, and you can imagine how attention. Another was the retail along Madison Avenue. Here were these expensive shops that were going out of business. You know, if they were out of business, if they weren't open for 2 days while they were waiting to get their permit and didn't sell an Italian suitcase for $10,000, they were bankrupt. So again, Frank and some of the commissioners drew up every shop front on Madison Avenue and said these really have to be very carefully managed. And others, if you don't increase the way you're moving horizontally or vertically, if you protect these features, make the awning any color you want. You know, if you want it to be purple, terrific. In a year, it'll be something else. And in a sense, trying to really make the regulation only what's necessary. And that requires trust. The public has to trust and believe in the staff of the Landmarks Commission, and they have to believe in the leadership of the commission, the commissioners, to do that. But it's an essential ingredient.
I was able to convince Mayor Koch, along with other people helping me, that the commission staff needed to be increased. And we got more people. We got a bigger staff. We got an office that looked like it was a city agency office as opposed to a storage shop. The original, and Kent, you remember this, the original Landmarks office that I walked into as you were walking out looked like a storage area. It took us 3 years almost and several moves from different places before we finally got an office at 225 Broadway that
means to engage that. It naturally lends itself to that, and I don't think that we've utilized that as much as we can. I also think we just need to, connect what we do to what people really do care about. I think it's a limited percentage of the public that hears the word historic preservation or landmarking and thinks that's me. But what it actually means, I think 90% of the public actually does care about that. And I think we need to sort of perhaps get beyond some of the traditional vocabulary and really communicate to people about what it is that they care about, the sense of place, the identity of their neighborhoods, what it is about the city that they love. And that really is, in essence, what we do.
I was going to say that I think it begins even sooner. And in fact, this question is yet another reminder of how much we need better arts education, better cultural education, better urban education. And in fact, kids at 5, 6, 7, and 8 should be learning to appreciate the city. I don't know how much they are doing that now, but to the extent they are, we will have a preservation constituency in the future.
Preservation should begin in the womb. Today's panel has given us much food for thought, and I just want to close with a little dessert maybe. The simple history of preservation in New York is that the Landmarks Law exists because New Yorkers demanded it, and that we have our Landmarks Law because New Yorkers fought to preserve and protect it. Preservation is a living example of the maxim, if the people lead, the leaders will follow. The future of the Landmarks Law, as was the case 50 years ago, is not in the hands of any one mayor or any one sitting chair of the commission. It is in the hands of New Yorkers. It was the citizens of New York who generated the political will that led to the passage of the Landmarks Law. And it is New Yorkers who must continue to sustain that political will to preserve the law. The next 50 years are in our hands and those who will follow us. It's never been easy to be a preservationist. Not 100 years ago, not 50 years ago, not today, and certainly not tomorrow. But the price of preservation, as a jurist once said, is constant vigilance. To imagine the price of the opposite, indifference, just call to mind the iconic holiday classic, It's a Wonderful Life. Replace Bedford Falls with New York City, and replace George Bailey with the Landmarks Law. To rededicate yourself to preservation of our law and the constant vigilance that it requires. Just imagine New York without the landmark you love. That would be New York without our truly wonderful law. Today, in this anniversary year, we salute our wonderful law on its Golden Jubilee and wish it many, many happy returns.
Lively, edifying, informative, sometimes even irreverent, as I did. All thanks to each and every one of you for your informed life and shared remarks. I think the panel was very generous, too, by recalling names past. Many, many worthies who contributed so much to the evolution of landmarks. I want to say a word about those names that will never receive wider public attention, particularly without benefit of an in-house lobbyist. But the fact is, this movement is comprised of the people of the city of New York. And if you just drive around every neighborhood, you will be elated to see what has happened to neighborhoods. And for the record, particularly in a place like this, many members of the Landmarks Commission were invited. Happily, some have attended. The chair was invited, accepted, and that empty chair had her name on it. But it is to be hoped she will join us on April 15th at the because we need a very close relationship with the Landmarks Commission that was underscored by all of the remarks today. And as for mobilizing, when we gathered together about 2 years ago to think of an appropriate commemoration of the Landmarks Law, I think I had a rather obvious, corny idea that wouldn't it be a good idea to have 50 organizations to gather together to commemorate the Landmarks Law. We now have 177 member organizations, still growing. Thank you, dear. In any case, there are still 8 more organizations waiting to become part of our membership. And that, I think, is the beginning of a mobilized public, and this we hope will be carried forward after this event. So my thanks to each and all of you, panelists, moderators, honored guests, audience, for joining us today. And now we will have the pleasure of reception, thanks to Judge Katzman and his staff. Thank you.